Boldwood presents Good Girls, written by Amanda Brookfield and read by Derryn Edwards. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Good Girls by Amanda Brookfield. I am no bird. No net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will. Jane Eyre. Part 1. Chapter 1. January 2013. Eleanor decided to take a taxi from the station, even though she knew it would cost £10 precious and mean a wait. Being so rural, only a handful of cars served the area, but she didn't want to be a bother to Howard, her brother-in-law. She texted both him and Kat to say she would be there within the hour, and stayed as warm as she could in the small, arched station entrance. It was a cold, dank morning, not raining for once, but with air like icy metal against her skin. The taxi driver, who pulled up some 20 minutes later, exuded an attitude of reluctance that made Eleanor disinclined to make conversation. When they hit a tailback, thanks to a loop round the old Roman bridge, still not fixed from the heavy flooding over the new year, he thumped his steering wheel. "A bloody joke! We can land men on the moon and still it takes 3 weeks to fix a few old stones." Eleanor murmured agreement, but found that she didn't mind much. The fields on either side of the road were still visibly waterlogged. After the grimy melee of South London, it was a visual feast. Ethereal, shimmering silver bands engraved with the black reflections of leafless trees and smudgy January clouds. The usual crisscross of feelings was stirring at being back in such proximity to the landscape of her childhood. Just 20 miles away, her father was a resident in a small care home called the Bressingham, which he had once included in his rounds as a parish priest, days long since lost to him through the fog of dementia. Howard and Kat's substantial Georgian house was 10 miles in the opposite direction, on the fringes of a town called Fairfield. They had moved from Holland Park 7 years before, a year after the birth of their third child, Evie. At the time, Eleanor had been surprised to get the change of address card. She had always regarded her little sister and husband as lifelong townies, Kat with her posh, quirky dressmaking commissions to private clients, and Howard with his big banker job. It was because they saw the house in a magazine and fell in love with it, Kat had explained at one of their rare subsequent encounters, in the manner of one long used to plucking things she wanted out of life, like fruits off a tree. But recently life had not been so cooperative. A small tumour had been removed from Kat's bowel, and she was in bed recovering. Howard had reported the event earlier in the week by email, and when Eleanor had got on the phone, as he must have known she would, he had said that the operation had gone well and that Kat was adamant that she didn't need sisterly visits. No further treatment was required. She would be up and about in a matter of days. Their regular babysitter, Hannah, was increasing her hours to plug gaps with the children, and he was taking a week off from his daily commute into the city. "But I am her sister," Eleanor had insisted, hurt in spite of knowing better. "I'd just like to see her. Surely she can understand that." Howard had said he would get back to her, but then Kat had phoned back herself, saying why didn't Eleanor pop down on Saturday afternoon? "Nice," said the driver, following Eleanor's instructions to turn between the laburnums that masked the handsome red brick walls and gleaming white sash windows, and pulling up behind the 2 family cars, both black, one a tank-sized station wagon, the other an estate. He fiddled with his sat-nav while Eleanor dug into her purse for the right money. "I'm not the rich one," she wanted to cry, seeing the visible sag of disappointment on his sheeny, unshaven face at the sight of her 20p tip. "I am merely the visiting elder sister who rents a flat by a Clapham railway line, who tutors slow or lazy kids to pay her bills, and who has recently agreed to write an old actor's memoirs for a sum that will barely see off her overdraft." Howard answered the door, taking long enough to compound Eleanor's apprehensions about having pushed for the visit. He was in a barber and carrying 3 brightly coloured backpacks, clearly on the way out of the house. "Good of you to come." Brandishing the backpacks, he kissed her perfunctorily on both cheeks. Brownies, go-karting and a riding lesson. Pickups in that order. Then 2 birthday parties and a bowling alley. God help me. See you later, maybe. She's upstairs," he added, somewhat unnecessarily. "The big sister arrives," Kat called out, before Eleanor had even crossed the landing. "Could you tuck that curtain wider?" she added, as Eleanor entered the bedroom. "I want as much light as possible." "So, how are you?" Eleanor asked, adjusting the offending drape en route to kissing Kat's cheek, knowing it was no moment to take offence at the big sister thing, in spite of the reflex of deep, instinctive certainty that Kat had said it to annoy. At 38, she was the big sister, by 3 years. She was also almost 6 foot, with the heavy-limbed, dark-haired, brown-eyed features that were such echoes of their father, while Kat, as had been pointed out as far back as either of them could remember, had inherited an uncanny replication of their mother's striking looks, from the lithe elfin frame and flinty blue feline eyes to the extraordinary eye-catching tumble of white blonde curls. "You look so well," Eleanor exclaimed, happiness at the truth of this observation making her voice bounce, while inwardly she marvelled at her sibling's insouciant beauty, utterly undiminished by the recent surgery. Her skin was like porcelain, faintly freckled, her hair in flames across the pillow. "Well, thank you, and thank goodness, because I feel extremely well," Kat retorted. "So please don't start telling me off again for not having kept you better informed. As I said on the phone, the fucking thing was small and isolated. They have removed it, snip, snip." She merrily scissored 2 fingers in the air. "So I am not going to need any further treatment, which is a relief, frankly, since I would hate to lose this lot." She yanked at one of the flames. "Shallow, I know, but there it is." "It's not shallow," Eleanor assured her quietly, experiencing one of the sharp twists of longing for the distant days when they had been little enough and innocent enough to take each other's affections for granted. They had been like strangers for years now, in comparison, shouting across an invisible abyss. She took off her cardigan, hanging it round the back of the bedroom chair before she sat down. The room was hot and smelt faintly medicinal. Several vases of flowers, lilies, roses and carnations, sat on the mantelpiece between get-well cards. Above them hung a huge plasma television screen, enough to put her off reading, Eleanor decided, let alone any other pleasurable nocturnal activities. "So, how did you know something was wrong, if you don't mind my asking?" Kat pulled a face. "Changes, which I have no wish to go into. Blood in the stool," she went on breezily nonetheless, as the doctors so delicately like to call it, being one of the many highlights, together with going too much or not at all. Little wonder I was in no hurry to discuss it with our GP. But then Howard said I was an idiot, and he was right. I like my husband." She grinned, leaning down to retrieve a pillow from the floor and slapping Eleanor's hand away when she leapt out of the chair to try to help. "Sorry, but I just don't want to fuss. Everybody is fussing and it's driving me fucking nuts." Eleanor leant against the wall by the bed while Kat settled herself. Spotting their father's old Bible on the bedside table, she picked it up, absently rifling through its pages. "And how are the children?" Kat's face lit up, as if a bulb had been turned on inside her. "Fantastic, thanks. Little monsters all. Annoying, demanding, wonderful. Luke has gone geeky and has a quiff and a last word for everything. Sophie is in love with horses. I think she would literally marry one if she could. And Evie, well, Evie is just Evie." She sighed dreamily. "On her own planet, as every 7-year-old should be." "Her asthma?" Eleanor ventured, painfully aware of how little she really knew of her sister's family life, the result of years of learned wariness, the age-old sense of being kept at arm's length. "Oh, that's all gone. She grew out of it, thank God." Kat picked up a glossy swatch of her hair and scrutinised the ends. "So, will you be visiting Dad? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak?" Her sharp blue eyes flicked from Eleanor's face to the Bible in her hands, dancing but steely. "I've come to see you, not him," Eleanor replied levelly, putting the book down. As she did so, An old empty envelope dropped out of its back pages. Scrawled across it in the big spider writing that Eleanor immediately recognised as having once flowed from their father's gold-tipped desk fountain pen was a note to their mother. "Darling Connie," it said. "Came home for a 10-min lunch. I love you. V. Kiss." "Hey, look at this." She held the note out to Kat. Her sister nodded. "Yes, it's been there like forever." "Has it? Oh, OK." Eleanor gently replaced the envelope, giving the book a pat as she closed it shut. A part of her waited to see if Kat said anything about their mother, whilst knowing she wouldn't, because she never did. "It's nice, though, isn't it?" she prompted. Given what happened, well, it can make one forget the good things. "Oh, I never forget good things," said Kat briskly. "By the way, you could borrow my car if you did want to visit Dad." "I've told you I don't want to. Thank you. Not this time." "It's up to you." Eleanor couldn't help laughing. "Are you trying to get rid of me or something?" "Of course not. I'm glad you came. Thank you for coming, Eleanor." "Don't be silly. I had to. I wanted to. I'm just so pleased the bloody thing was harmless." Eleanor returned to the window, folding her arms and gripping her elbows. "I do go and see him from time to time, you know." "I know you do." "Not as much as you, but—" Kat had been the favoured child, at least when they were little, and if it hadn't been Kat in the spotlight, it had been their mother, or God. When it came to the focus of Vincent's attention, it was invariably Eleanor who had come last. "It's fine, Ellie." "It's like visiting a corpse." "Yes, it is." "So, what can I do now I'm here?" Eleanor asked brightly, wanting to wrest both of them back to the reason for her visit. "Tea? A biscuit? Or is there something you'd like me to do? Hoovering? Shopping? I'd so like to be useful." "There's nothing, thanks. Hannah, our babysitter, and Howard are doing a brilliant job of keeping the show on the road." Kat lay back against her pillows, her expression growing distant. "Hey, guess what? I have just been commissioned to write another memoir," Eleanor blurted. "This time it's that actor, Trevor Downes. He's really old now, but—" She broke off, feeling foolish, as Kat's eyes fell shut. Her sister's skin looked starkly pale suddenly, beside the white January sunlight, now spooling into the room through breaks in the cloud, and falling into misty pools on the silky grey carpet. There were marbled veins at her temples that Eleanor had never noticed before, threading under her cheekbones like the blue in a soft pearly cheese. It made her want to stroke Kat's face, show the protective tenderness which always hovered, but which never seemed able to come out. She moved towards the bed, but stopped as Kat puckered her lips, seemingly in preparation to speak. But then her mouth fell still again, the lips slack and slightly open. Eleanor turned back to the window, feeling at a loss. The garden spread beneath her was ridiculously huge and orderly, comprising not just terraces of well-tended lawns and flower beds, but an all-weather tennis court and the smart black rectangle of a covered swimming pool. Kat had been such a wild child that there was something about this tidy state of adult affluence that Eleanor still found hard to buy into. Yet she was hardly in a position to be critical, she mused, the cul-de-sac of her decade in Oxford coming back at her, the pitiful hanging on because of Igor, the Russian academic who had asked her to write his life story and then swept her into an affair before returning to his wife in Moscow, the subsequent abandoned and useless efforts at fiction, the ad hoc tutoring to pay bills, not to mention a social life which, in the 3 years since moving to London, had somehow deteriorated into a state of lurching oscillation between abject indolence and a sexual promiscuity that she couldn't have confessed to anyone, least of all her self-contained, snugly nested little sister. A recent nadir had been reached in the form of opening her flat door to the husband of her oldest and best friend from university, dear Megan. Eleanor dug her fingernails into her forearms as the shame flared. Billy had been in London for a stag do. They had said drunken farewells through a taxi window after a chance encounter in a nightclub. Megan had been many miles away, safely ensconced with their 3 boys in their Welsh home. No, Eleanor had said. But when Billy had reached for the zip on her dress, she had turned, lifting her heavy tumble of hair to make his task easier. Eleanor had tiptoed as far as the bedroom doorway when Kat's eyes flew open.
"Actually, there is something I want, Ellie. Something to show you. I don't know how I could have forgotten. Hang on a minute while I—"
Seeing the grimace of determination as Kat manoeuvred herself out of bed, Eleanor sprang back across the room to help, only to be met with a warning hand to keep away. She took a step back, aware of the deep-buried reflex of looking after her little sister stirring again.
"I'm fine, honestly," Kat assured her tetchily. "It's good to move. The doctor said. No one is supposed to lie around after an operation these days. They get you up and about as soon as possible."
She stood, pausing to let the crumples in her long white nightshirt fall free, and then moved steadily to a dark green and orange silk kimono hanging on the back of the bedroom door. She slid herself into it with a quick, graceful shake of her shoulders, deftly knotting the cord into a big floppy butterfly bow off her hip.
"We're going to my study. Prepare to be surprised."
She tapped her nose and grinned, looking so restored and pleased with herself that Eleanor did not have the heart to do anything but follow her downstairs. Kat's study was a cosy end-of-corridor room, containing a desktop computer, a voluminous orange beanbag, an oak chest spilling with sewing equipment, and a tailor's dummy swathed in a sari of lilac silk. Kat went straight to the desk and plucked a sheet of A4 out of the tray of her printer.
"My surprise is this."
She shoved the paper under Eleanor's nose, beaming.
"It arrived this morning. Talk about a blast from the past. I want to hear your views."
She pronounced the word as if it was a great joke, sliding past Eleanor and settling herself on the beanbag, from where she began to adjust some lower folds in the lilac silk, her small, nail-bitten fingers working nimbly.
"I printed it off so it was easier to read. Take your time,"
she mumbled, managing, in spite of having several pins between her lips, to communicate impatience. The paper was an email. Noting who it was from, Eleanor leant back against the desk in a subtle bid to steady herself, marvelling both at the timing of its arrival and the reminder of her little sister's relentless and unfailing ability to wrong-foot her. From n.wharton@queenelizabeth.org.sa. Subject: Greetings. Dear Kat, this is just a friendly inquiry to ask how the hell you are. Something perhaps to do with the big 4-0 being on the imminent horizon, wanting to take stock, etc. Where did 20 years go? That's what I keep asking myself. I hope you're well and happy. Are you well and happy? As for me, doctoring took me to dermatology, and for the past 10 years I have been working as a consultant at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital here in Cape Town, hence the above email address. I have a South African wife, Donna, and 2 beautiful daughters. They take after their mother, Natalie and Sasha, aged 15 and 13. We are lucky enough to live in Constantia, a beautiful area outside Cape Town, in case you didn't know, in a house with a big garden, pool, etc., and views across the valley towards the city and the famous Table Mountain. Donna is very happy being near her family. We moved here 10 years ago from London, where I worked at King's after my elective. Her father is a successful property developer, and they have a superb estate in Rondebosch, where she and the girls are able to keep their horses and go riding. Yours truly prefers tennis. Living relatively far out of town, Donna is kept very busy running around after the girls. They go to school in the city and have hectic social lives. Well, Kat, I was just wanting to touch base, a friendly line after 20 years. It would be good to hear some news back from you, if you had the time. By the way, how's Eleanor these days? Say hi from me if you see her. Best wishes, Nick, brackets, Wharton. Eleanor read slowly, trying to hear the Nick she remembered between the sentences. There were lots of brackets and exclamation marks, she observed wryly, her expert eye scanning the text. Far too many. Only nerves could account for it, she decided, feeling a flutter of the old bitterness that after so many years and all that had happened, Nick Wharton should still betray such signs of jitters when placing himself across the path of her little sister. "Well, what do you think?" Kat urged. She had finished with her repinning and was back in the beanbag, sitting cross-legged now, her knees neat bulges under her silk gown, her big blue eyes electric and staring.
Nice that friendly lime bit, don't you think?
Yup, very nice. Eleanor was trying to picture Nick in Cape Town in a white coat, being a proper doctor.
Well, do you think I should reply?
It's up to you, Eleanor smiled. It was one thing to be wrong-footed, quite another to show it.
But what do you think?
Eleanor shrugged. She found it hard to believe that Kat really wanted her opinion.
If you help me, Kat added impishly, it would take no more than a few minutes.
Me help you? Why on earth would you want me to do that? Eleanor set down the letter and moved away from the desk. Kat was putting her through some sort of sick test, she decided, prodding her emotions to see what came out. She had forgotten the power of her sister. Kat did what she wanted, and everyone else dealt with the consequences. She either didn't care or didn't notice.
It would take me hours, but you'll be able to do it in 2 minutes, Kat pleaded. I'm crap with words, all dyslexic and rubbish. Not like you, always so brilliant.
It'd be silly, Eleanor murmured, something inside her softening nonetheless. Nick Wharton was such water under the bridge. Ancient water, ancient bridge.
I'll tell you what I want to say and you make it better, Kat instructed, leaving her perch to turn on the computer and then pressing Eleanor into the desk chair. We'll do a cheerful potted history like he did, preferably not mentioning the jolly business of having had some of my guts removed.
You've got follow-up checks and things, have you?
Oh, heaps. Now let's get on with it.
Kat settled herself back into the dent she had left in the beanbag, lying on her side this time, one arm protectively cradling her lower stomach.
Start with, "Hi, Nick."
Eleanor obediently began to type. Kat, for whatever reason, had decided she should help with the letter. Test or whim, it was what she wanted. "And you're sure Howard won't mind?" She glanced up in surprise as her sister hissed an expletive and slapped the beanbag. "What?" Kat was sitting bolt upright, glaring at her. Eleanor stared back in disbelief. It occurred to her that if she had needed reminders of why they didn't see more of each other, Kat could not have been doing a better job. A long time ago, her sister had simply stopped liking her, Eleanor reflected bleakly. It was the only explanation. The sole wonder was her own difficulty in accepting the fact.
"Judging me," Kat snapped. "Bossing me, like you think you have some sort of right because of, well, just because you're older."
"I never think like that."
"For your information, not that it's any of your business, Howard and I respect each other's privacy. We give each other space. That's one of the reasons I married him. He lets me be, unlike most other people I've come across, like Nick Wharton, for example. Oh, my God, the man was such a limpet. It's all coming back to me."
Suddenly, she was snorting with laughter.
"Mr. Clingy! Ugh! No wonder I was horrible to him."
She rolled her face into the beanbag, pretending to chew the fabric. "Why don't you leave him alone, then?" Eleanor asked quietly. Kat stopped her rolling and sat up.
"Because not replying might just seem rude. And where's the harm?"
For a moment, Eleanor imagined picking up the computer keyboard and hurling it across the room. She pictured the dummy falling, its robes of lilac flapping like a giant bird, pins pinging in showers of silver rain. But it would upset Kat again, and that would be bad. The kimono had fallen slightly open, affording a clearer view of the outline of the bandaging thickening her sister's slim waist. "You are right," she conceded softly, quickly looking away. "So, let's get on with it. Where were we?"
"Hi, Nick, I think."
Kat plucked at a thread on her gown.
"You're just so serious sometimes, Ellie. It can drag people down. And you're not to be too clever for this, OK? I'll suggest stuff and you phrase it nicely. But the letter's from me, remember? The muggins who scraped 5 GCSEs, not the bright star who went to Oxford."
10 minutes later, Eleanor read out the completed version, a wholly collaborative effort apart from the exclamation marks, which she had scattered liberally, telling herself that writers with sick, spoilt, bafflingly manipulative little sisters had to get their kicks where they could. "Hi, Nick. What a surprise to hear from you after so much time!" ! "It was great to get all your news of what sounds like the most wonderful life. I have never been to Cape Town, but know of the famous Table Mountain, of course. How incredible to wake up to that every morning! ! You asked for news of me and mine, so here goes. I have also been lucky with how things turned out. I stayed as a fashion dog's body for a few more years, but gave up work after I got married in 1998. Hard to believe that was 15 years ago! ! My husband Howard is a fund manager with Bouvray Smith. We live near a place called Fairfield in East Sussex, not a million miles from Broughton, which perhaps you remember! ! We've got 3 kids, Luke, who's 13 and brainy like his dad, Sophie, who's 11 going on 25, and Evie, who's 7 and probably most like me! We are also lucky enough to have a lovely house and garden, lots of space for the kids to run around in. We even have a pool, though the English weather probably means we don't use it quite as much as you do yours! Howard has to commute, which is a pain, but apart from that, life is pretty good. I do a bit of dressmaking, but otherwise spend my time being a mum, like your wife Donna by the sounds of things, running around after the little darlings! Well, Nick, thanks for your email. I can't imagine you 40 years old, I must say. Though of course it will be my turn in a few more years! Eleanor is visiting at the moment and says hi back. Take care and all the best for the next 40! Kat, Gallagher these days, but I still use Keating sometimes. Was that how you tracked me down? ? By the way, you know if you end with a question he's more likely to write back. Is he? It's human nature. Is it? Do you want him to write back? Dunno. Kat frowned. Oh, I guess not. Take it out then. Out it goes. Eleanor deleted the second sentence in the bracket. Oh, and add a kiss, please. Just one, lowercase. Everybody kisses everybody these days after all, don't they? A kiss means literally nothing. Does it? Eleanor murmured, adding one small cross next to Kat's name, and resisting the urge to point out that Nick's signing off had been much more formal. Kat could still have any man she wanted, she reflected, with a twist of weary pride. Age, motherhood, illness made no difference. One snap of her little sister's fingers, and men fell like ninepins. They always had. They always would. An hour and a half later, after tea and some delicious ginger biscuits reputedly made by Hannah, the babysitter, they were on the doorstep, conducting farewells in the glare of Eleanor's taxi headlights. Kat had by then showered and changed into a grey glitter-flecked mohair jumper, loose black trousers, and bright red Converse trainers. The jumper shone in the light, catching the sparkle in her eyes. She looked radiant, transformed. Would you come again? She said suddenly. If I asked? Of course. Whenever, if you ask. Eleanor bounced the phrase back casually, knowing Kat was laying down her terms. She had in fact reached a state of longing to be gone, to be on her own. Ill or not, her sister was such hard work, so ready to fight, so good at making her feel there was something she needed to apologise for. If only she could figure out what it was. OK, cool. Or you could come and see me in London, Eleanor offered. Take a break from Howard and the kids. We could have lunch or something. Oh, yes, we must, Kat cried, as if she might even mean it, when they both knew she didn't. 10 minutes into Eleanor's train journey, a text came through from Megan. You OK? Long time no hear. Kiss, kiss. Eleanor gripped her phone, seeing again her friend's husband's big, square, dismayed face peering at her over the mangled sheets of her bed linen 3 weeks before. The morning mortification had been mutual. Billy had loped off like a whipped dog, and she had stumbled to the toilet to throw up with a violence that she knew was as much about self-abhorrence as her hangover. The Trevor Downs Commission had come through on the very same day. A flimsy lifeline, it had felt like, the pretext she needed to clean her act up and start again. Eleanor stared at the message. She was pretty sure Billy wouldn't say anything, but that didn't make it any better or easier. Slowly she typed back, "Fine, mad busy, in touch soon, kiss kiss." Megan would also have noticed her recent lack of communication on social media, she knew. Shutting the world out was a lot easier, she was discovering. Fewer mistakes got made, less money got spent. Aloneness was the key. Eleanor rested her forehead against the cold, grimy train window, her mind drifting back to Kat's bullishness over Nick's email. Yet it had been easy in the end. Words pinging into an inbox on another continent, sunny sentences. The past was the past, after all. A foreign country, as someone a lot wiser than her had once pointed out. She closed her eyes with a sigh. Human lives were so messy, that was the trouble. It all began simply enough. One got born, but then stuff started to happen, blocking pathways, burying love and truth, till only a fraction of anything made sense. Chapter 2. Nick Wharton logged into his work email. There was always lots to attend to. Through the window in front of him he could see his 2 daughters splashing in the pool, trying to push each other off the big inflatable dolphin, a toy owned and played with for so long it was a wonder it stayed afloat. The house was solidly built, double-glazed against the winds that could pick up suddenly across the Cape. It reduced his daughter's joyful shrieks to muffles, contributing to a sense of cocooned solitariness that Nick found he couldn't quite enjoy in spite of having sought it out. Donna was under the parasol at the table, busy on her iPad, a bottle of one of her expensive mineral waters parked in an ice bucket beside a tall lead crystal glass. She had made the most of the hot January weather by swimming and was wearing a white muslin caftan, recently bought from one of her favourite designer outlets in the waterfront mall. It looked fantastic against her olive skin, and with the black lines of her bikini peeking through the mesh. Bored by the correspondence most in need of attention, Nick scrolled back to the emails he'd been firing off to old acquaintances in the weeks since his milestone birthday, and the various replies. It had been enjoyable as well as reassuring to find how easy it was to track people down and to hear news of their busy lives. It had also made him realise, a little wistfully, how far he had moved away from his early doctoring days in England. Coming across what Kat Keating had written back the weekend before, he paused, skimming again through the sentences. The tone was typical Kat, he decided, exuberant but faintly dismissive, skating over the surface of things, not wanting to get stuck in. She had seemed such an alluring, locked box of a girl, but when you got close, it was like there was nothing to come out, or at least nothing she was prepared to give. And of course, someone like that had landed squarely on her feet, back in the home counties, a rich husband in tow. He would have expected no less, a golden couple with a swanky country house. No wonder the email was so light, so watertight, so insouciant. Through the window, Donna caught his eye and held up her arm to tap the silver bracelet watch on her wrist. The pool was now empty, the dolphin abandoned, bobbing in a far corner on a jet from the filter. It was time for him to take Natalie to her dance class. His wife had her sunglasses on, but Nick didn't need to see her expression to know she was irritated. He held up his hand, spreading the fingers to indicate 5 minutes, and moved on through the correspondence to another reply, a very funny one this time, from a man with whom he had spent many happy youthful hours. Good old Peter Wycliffe. Erstwhile eccentric student, now a professor of cardiology, making life-and-death decisions in an Oxford hospital. It seemed ridiculous they had ever lost touch. Nick began to type a funny letter back until a tapping made him look up again. Donna had taken her sunglasses off and was using them to rap on the window. "Now," she mouthed at him, stretching her beautiful curved Cupid's bow lips into an angry O, her blue eyes flashing. Nick nodded, leaving his desk and putting his head out into the hall to call upstairs. "Nat, are you ready?" "Nearly," she yelled. There was the squeak of bare feet scampering along the wooden landing floor, followed by the slam of a door.
"Sasha's taken my shoes!" "Have not!"
yelped her younger sister. "Sort it, you two," Nick warned, adding, 5 minutes, tops. He turned back to his laptop, reluctantly closing down the tabs. When he glanced up, his eldest daughter was lolling in the doorway, her ballet kit bag slung over one shoulder. Noting his air of preoccupation, she shot him a look of wary puzzlement.
"What? We're not that late, are we?"
Nick closed the lid of his computer. "No, we are not. And you're a good girl." He kissed her head and picked up the ballet bag, whistling and tossing his keys as they made their way out to the car. Chapter 3. October 1992. The mushroom was the size of a dinner plate. Behind it, blackening its profile, stretched the steely dawn sky, the sun a brushstroke of pink across its middle. Eleanor blinked in wonderment, her sleepy brain conjuring images of an Alice in Wonderland-style dinner party, attendants seated round the mushroom's flat, sleek ebony top. Beside her, Kat started humming softly. She was barefoot, up to her ankles, in the dew-damp grass, her party dress testifying to another all-nighter. Gold strappy shoes dangled carelessly from the middle finger of her left hand.
"Still pissed off I got you out of bed?"
"I was awake anyway."
"Yeah, right."
They both stared at the mushroom. It was Kat's idea of a gift, Eleanor guessed, an effort to be nice on her last morning at home.
"It could be breakfast, I thought."
Kat swung the shoes. "Eat it, you mean?"
"Yes, Dumbo."
She bulged her tongue into her lower lip. She looked exhausted, wild-eyed, wild-haired, glorious. The dress she was wearing was one of the ones she had lately started running up herself, using their mother's old sewing box and Singer machine, a tight red bodice, sprouting a concoction of silk and lace panels in electric colours. From somewhere in the tangle of hair behind her left ear, she extracted a flattened roll-up, slipping it between her lips, but making no move to light it.
"For all we know, it could be poisonous."
"It's not."
"And how would you know?"
"Because I do." "You shouldn't smoke."
"Fuck off."
Eleanor turned to face her younger sister, arms folded, her gaze steady. The hostility was old hat now. She had got used to it.
"And where were you last night?"
"What's it to you?" Kat smiled slyly, displaying the small gap between her front teeth that for some reason Eleanor could never fathom made her look cute. "I hope you're careful." Kat rolled her eyes, feigning shock.
"Oh, yes, we must be careful, mustn't we? Like you would know so much about that, wouldn't you, Miss Big Brain? You're not Mum, so don't try to be," she added nastily. "And if you want to tell Dad, then go right ahead."
"You know I wouldn't tell Dad," Eleanor murmured. In just a few hours she was going away to start university. Starting her life, it felt like. Kat could be Kat, wild and bad, without her having to worry about it. The mighty mushroom was auspicious for her, Eleanor decided. Her stomach cramped with sudden joy and terror at the prospect of heaving the old suitcase her father had dug out of the cellar into the trunk of her English teacher's Minnie and journeying to the sandy-stoned college that had miraculously offered her the chance to spend 3 years doing nothing but reading and writing about English literature. There would be some Anglo-Saxon to study too, Miss Saffron had told her, stories about someone called Beowulf and a Green Knight. A dreamy-eyed look had come into her English teacher's eyes as she described them. Eleanor stole a glance at Kat, who was smoking the cigarette at last, screwing up her eyebrows and doing her best to hold it like a man between her thumb and index finger, the hot tip tucked into her palm. Pity rushed at her. "You can come and visit me, you know." Kat looked away.
"Like that's going to happen."
"You'll be 16 soon. He'll let you then."
"I wouldn't want to anyway, all those dull Oxford weirdos."
She crossed her eyes. "Thanks."
"You're welcome."
She flicked the roll-up into a patch of soft mud where it sat smoking. "Dad would be better if you left him alone more. If you didn't always get at him."
"Don't fucking tell me how to deal with Dad."
She dropped to a crouching position and circled the mushroom with her arms. Her bony knees stuck out from under the bunched-up panels of the dress.
We simply must eat this, she crooned. Fried, on toast, loads of butter.
Her lips looked raw round the edges, making Eleanor wonder again about the knight, whom Kat had been with, what they had done. Anxiety heaved, but so dimly did envy. In her own case, boys seemed to steer a wide berth, apart from Charlie Watson, the son of their farmer neighbour. Charlie had a straggly sun-bleached fringe and a crooked smile that masked a jumble of teeth. Whenever Eleanor saw him bouncing along in a farm vehicle or striding across a field with his father, he waved and grinned. But whenever they got close, he seemed to shrink into himself, stuttering inanities, unless they were actually kissing. She knew her height didn't help. Standing up, his eyes were level with her collarbone. It made her want to run away sometimes, just to put the poor boy out of his misery. From somewhere among the voluminous panels of her dress, Kat had whipped out a tiny penknife and was hacking at the stem of the mushroom. Eleanor released an involuntary gasp.
Don't! I told you we don't even know if we can eat it. And I told you we can, Kat sneered. It's okay. The same kind are in the shops, just smaller. Christ, you're such a scaredy cat.
I just don't want to die, Eleanor muttered, adding to herself, at least not today. She looked away, unable to watch.
Gotcha!
Kat cried, plucking the mushroom free and holding it over her head like a ghoulish trophy, heedless of the shower of earth raining into her silver bush of hair.
Wow, Ellie! Look at that! Just huge! We should get a camera, take a picture.
Mark the day you poisoned me, you mean? They caught each other's eye and laughed properly and joyfully, and suddenly Eleanor was so sad to be leaving she could have wept. They walked back in silence across the field, that year an empty square of weeds and compacted earth, Kat carelessly swinging the mushroom by its stalk.
Just don't let Dad get you down, okay? She ventured as they neared the garden gate. He can't help how he is. Can't he? You know he can't. He should be taking you today.
What?
Today. He should be driving you. It's not right.
But Miss Saffron wants to. It's only because of her that...
Oh, shit, I'm going to have to leg it.
Kat jerked her head in the direction of a light that had flicked on at the largest of the vicarage's top-floor windows.
If he catches me like this...
She thrust the mushroom at Eleanor and set off at a run, taking the long way round the garden, under the lee of the hedge that fringed the silver birch wood. Eleanor sighed and walked on, picturing how Kat would race up the drive and down the side of the house, where the 4 stone steps plunged to the unlocked cellar door. From there she would scamper up the back staircase to her bedroom, silent as dear old Titch, the vicarage cat, prowling round their stop-start comings and goings on his neat tiger paws. Entering the kitchen 10 minutes later, Vincent's eyes widened at the sight of the mushroom, which Eleanor had wiped clean and placed on a chopping board next to the frying pan. What wonders the earth holds in store. He bent down to study it more closely, putting on his half-moon spectacles and taking them off again. Kat says it's okay to eat. Does she now? He tugged at the thinning grey fringe of his beard.
She does, Kat announced, appearing in the doorway behind them, miraculously spruce in her school uniform, her hair fastened into a ponytail that coralled the walls of hair into an explosion at the nape of her neck. And you trust me, Daddy-o, don't you?
Indeed I do, Vincent replied mildly, not looking at her. He turned to Eleanor instead, asking her if she was packed and ready. When she said she was, he said he had a gift for her. He disappeared to his study, returning a few minutes later with a small dog-eared dictionary. To help you with all those essays you're going to have to write. Thanks, Dad. Eleanor found it hard to speak. He was so rarely attentive it caught her off guard.
Yeah, why use one short word where 4 long ones will do? Snorted Kat, pushing between them to take charge of the cooking.
Not a morning for silliness, is it? Said Vincent tightly, pulling out a chair to sit down. Eleanor could see the vein in his left temple twitching. Kat had tied the frayed, stained kitchen apron over her uniform and was slicing the mushroom into chunks, tossing them into a pool of melted butter in the frying pan. She stirred with a wooden spoon till the pieces hissed and shriveled. She was so needy, and Vincent wouldn't see it, Eleanor reflected sadly. Kat longed for attention and approval, but he blocked her at every turn. And maybe that wouldn't have mattered if he hadn't once done the opposite. It didn't matter for her. She was used to being on the outside, negotiating the dark tunnels of her father's moods. But Kat had never tried to negotiate anything. She just bulldozed on, making trouble. "Kat was the one who found the mushroom," she gabbled. "So clever of her. Inspired." "She must have been up and out early for that." "I was." Kat threw him a look from under her long mascara-blackened eyelashes. She lifted the frying pan off the hob, shaking and tossing the mushroom chunks as if they were a pancake. "Very early. I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk." "I'll do toast," Eleanor muttered, rummaging for a knife and sawing with a desperation that went beyond the hardness of the bread. She shook the loose crumbs into the toaster, which hadn't worked for years, and slid 3 fat slices of bread under the grill. Seated in front of their food a few minutes later, the slabs of toast serving as hefty plates for the heaps of fried mushroom, Vincent pressed his palms together and closed his eyes, as he always did. Kat scowled at Eleanor, as she always did. "I can't wait to go," Eleanor thought wildly as her emotions seesawed again. The routines between the three of them were so wearing, an invisible vortex, sucking her down. To be free of it would be like coming up for air. The mushroom wedges, sodden with butter, were as soft and succulent as steak. Eleanor was too sick with nerves to eat much, but Kat wolfed her portion, and Vincent had seconds, wiping the last of the grease off his plate with a ragged crust of toast. Afterwards he patted his stomach, these days a notable bulk beneath his cassock, and stifled a string of husky burps. "The Lord provides bountifully, doesn't he, Daddy?" quipped Kat, giving Eleanor a look of disgust. "If you know where to seek." Vincent swivelled his gloomy eyes to his youngest daughter. The pupils narrowed to pencil dots. Kat merely smiled back at him, one of her big, bold, toothy smiles that dimpled her cheeks and lifted up the corners of her mouth. And suddenly Vincent was smiling back at her, an iceberg melting. "The Lord certainly does. Exactly." He pulled out a grubby handkerchief and dabbed cheerfully at the grease specks in his beard. "You're missing bits," Kat cried, leaping round the table to pat his face with a dishcloth, pushing too far as she always did, so that Vincent was soon glowering again, flapping his hands at her to be left alone. Eleanor took refuge in the washing up, spinning round with an involuntary cry of relief when a car horn sounded in the drive. Kat hugged her from behind, briefly, and then bolted into the hall to watch proceedings from the window seat, belting her arms round her shins and pressing her teeth into her knees. When Eleanor appeared from upstairs, laden with bags, Vincent trundling ahead of her with the old suitcase, Kat swiftly averted her gaze, keeping it fixed on the window. "Bye, Kat," Eleanor called softly. "Bye." She snapped the word like a whip. Out in the drive, Vincent had stowed her case in the boot and was engaging the English teacher in the usual animated exchanges he managed for outsiders. Eleanor pawed at the gravel with the toe of her shoe. The lump in her throat ebbed and swelled, maddening, given how keen she was to be gone. "Well, goodbye, child," Vincent growled, turning to her at last and placing his heavy spade hands on her shoulders. "You are all clear on money, aren't you?" He looked at her. For the first time in years, it felt like, with the big, dark eyes that were such a mirror of her own. Eleanor nodded. The money was a princely £80 monthly allowance, on top of a full government grant. It was another thing that made her feel guilty, but also thrilled. "Study hard." She nodded again, aware of her English teacher on the far side of the car, tactfully staring in the opposite direction, towards the sloping tail-end ribs of the downs. "And remember," Vincent went on mournfully, still pressing her shoulders, "the Lord gives each of us talents, just as he gives each of us burdens. We must accept both with good grace." He released his hands at last, such a heaviness lifting that Eleanor had a strong sensation of floating rather than walking the couple of feet to the car. The feeling stayed with her for several minutes after she had settled into her seat, contributing to the sense of flying, as she and Miss Saffron took off down the lane, the wheels of the little car rocking and thwacking between the potholes and ridges. Eleanor waited until the bend to look back. The drive was empty, But Kat was still there, her face a white smudge behind the hall window. Chapter 4.
So, are you coming?
In a minute, I just need to... Eleanor gestured helplessly at the books piled around her corner of the library table, an ill-constructed semicircular wall sprouting pencils and torn scraps of paper, where she was trying to keep track of relevant paragraphs. The books weren't the ones she had been recommended. Those had already been whipped out of the library by the smarter, faster members of her year group. Instead, she was trawling through turgid tomes that were in no demand whatsoever, desperate to unearth any snippet of information that might assist in the otherwise impossible task of tackling an essay entitled Beowulf, Poet or Warrior. It was on being presented with these 4 words the previous Wednesday, her 3rd week of term, that Eleanor had started facing up to the realisation that she was stupid. Worse still, she was a fraud. Since arriving, she had so far cobbled together just one composition on whether Thomas Hardy was more of a social reformer than a novelist, managing an answer of sorts by drawing heavily on Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which she had been fortunate enough to study in the 6th form with Miss Saffron. It had garnered a few dry words of encouragement from her college tutor, a softly-spoken Irishman with kind grey eyes, who had then offered a respite of sorts in the form of a 2-week spell looking at Dickens, with whom she was also lucky enough to have had some previous acquaintance. But Anglo-Saxon was another matter. For that, she and her peers had been directed to attend the overheated, chaotic rooms of a man called Dr. Pugh, who resided in another college and who preferred to rain down his words of wisdom and much spittle from the top of a set of library steps parked against one of his many book stacks. With his domed, hairless head, beady black eyes glittering behind thick lens spectacles, Eleanor found herself unable to look at him without thinking of a bald-headed eagle about to swoop onto his prey. When he announced the Beowulf essay, flinging down each word from his favoured perch, along with fluttering copies of a recommended reading list, the rest of her group had jumped to catch the pieces of paper like gleeful children chasing leaves. But Eleanor had stayed in her chair, frozen by the certainty that there was no way she would be able to answer such a question satisfactorily in 7 years, let alone 7 days.
So, are you coming or not?
Eleanor could hear the mounting impatience in her companion's voice. She was a girl called Camilla, also a fresher, but studying history, not English. Her own few books had been cleared away and buckled into the smart leather bag she wore across her chest. She occupied the room next to Eleanor's in the modern honeycomb of a block where the college housed most of its first-year students. Bumping into each other within hours of their arrival, they had braved the first meal in hall together and stuck to each other's sides ever since.
You go on,
Eleanor urged. I'll catch you up.
But we might not eat lunch there. Billy said there was a chance of hooking up with some others.
That's fine. Camilla fiddled with the strap on her shoulder bag.
The point being that if you don't come now, you might not find us.
She spoke in a whisper, even though it was past 1 o'clock, and they were the only 2 people left in the library.
I know. That's okay, honestly.
Still, Camilla hesitated at the corner of the library table. She was well brought up. She had heavy, straight blonde hair cut in ramrod lines, so that her face looked as if it was perpetually staring out of a small window. She had come from an established girls' boarding school and acted with all the confidence Eleanor both feared and expected to find in the produce of such places. A strong voice, strong opinions, coupled with a brusque self-confidence. She played hockey and tennis and had signed up for college rowing. She had big green eyes, set at a feline slant, and wide nostrils that flared when she was amused, which was quite often.
"Are you spoken for?"
she had asked Eleanor, having invited her in for a coffee just minutes after they met. Her own identical box of a room had already been transformed into a homely, softly lit collage of lamps, beads, spreads, posters and knickknacks, causing Eleanor to reflect with shame on the lacklustre efforts of her own unpacking. A few books on the desk, her toothbrush and paste on the edge of the basin, the big old suitcase still spilling with the heavy winter clothes that had proved too bulky to cram into the room's meagre wardrobe. "No," Eleanor had admitted shyly. thinking of and dismissing the unsatisfactory and intermittent fumblings with poor Charlie Watson.
"Clever you. Good. I dumped mine before coming up. We might have some fun then, might we not?"
Eleanor had nodded, grateful and faintly alarmed to have found such an amicable and adventurous friend so early on. But 3.5 weeks into term, and Camilla was tiring of her, she could tell. With the proximity of their rooms, she suspected she had merely provided a convenient starting point for Camilla's social ambitions, the first rung on what would be a tall ladder. She had not yet stopped Eleanor from sharing her company, but an air of endurance had crept into the arrangement. Several other people were now being made much more obviously welcome. People like the charismatic Billy Stokes, who was behind that day's nebulous lunch plan. A fellow historian with a cherubic smile and the big square body of a seasoned rugby player, Billy was one of those who seemed to know everyone he passed in the street, sharing not only Camilla's armadillo confidence, but also her apparent determination to put having fun above the priorities of academic work. Eleanor marvelled at and envied their insouciance. She did not dare to slacken off her own studies for a moment. Stupid people had to work harder, she knew that. More to the point, she literally could not afford to enjoy herself in the cavalier manner that they did. Lunch with Billy and his friends would mean drinks, food, then more drinks, necessitating the recurring shame of having to remind them all that she was on a tight budget. It had taken Eleanor a couple of weeks to realise this herself. What had once felt like riches was evaporating at terrifying speed. Books, stationery, tea, coffee, milk, bread, sugar, the couple of subs for societies to which she had boldly and misguidedly committed herself during the course of Freshers' Fair, had already proved such a drain on her finances that she was starting to wonder how she would last the term, let alone the year. Her new friends claimed to share such anxieties, but then joked easily about increasing overdraft limits and wheedling more money out of their parents. Eleanor laughed with them, inwardly picturing Vincent's granite face, knowing there was nothing more to come out of him, financial or otherwise. Camilla at last conceded defeat and took off. Eleanor twirled her pencil in a show of careless farewell, but the moment the library door swung shut, she stabbed the pencil's lead point into her palm, repeating the attack until she had created a circle of deep pink indentations in her skin. The silence of the old room was suffocating. No one else needed to work through their lunch hour, she reflected bitterly. No one else was so stupid. The pride of Broughton, the head, Mrs. Mayfield had called her in Leavers' Assembly. Looking back on it now, recalling the self-conscious prickle of pleasure on her scalp as all heads in the small school had turned to stare, Eleanor could have laughed out loud. When the door creaked open a few minutes later, she hurriedly pretended to concentrate on her notes, watching out of the corner of her eye as a tall young man with dusty brown hair strode down the central aisle, peering between the bookshelves, clearly in search of a person rather than a book. He was wearing a shapeless cabled grey jumper that looked home-knitted and loose black jeans, from the bottom of which protruded the pointed toes of scuffed desert boots. He clicked his fingers as he walked, as if keeping beat to some rhythm inside his head. Eleanor adopted a studious frown and started to copy out a sentence from one of the dense texts in front of her. Beowulf is composed of 3,182 alliterative lines. "Excuse me?" She glanced up. He had wide blue eyes and a clean-shaven face. A year or two older than her, she guessed. His hair was remarkably thick, the sort of hair that swelled outwards as much as it grew downwards. He had a pencil tucked behind one ear and several pens sticking out of his front jeans pocket, snagging on the hem of the jumper. "Have you seen Miss Coulham?" I don't think so. Who is she?" "The college librarian," he said, clearly surprised. "Very tall, quite old, hair like a Luftwaffe pilot. Scary lady." He pulled a face. "She normally sits over there under Samuel." He gestured at the large desk set at the foot of a plinth, sporting a marble bust of a man with a bulbous nose and long hair. "Samuel?" Eleanor echoed faintly, inwardly still cowering at the ignorance of having forgotten the name of the person in charge of her own college library. "Johnson, the dictionary man." "Yes, of course, the dictionary man." Later, Nick would tell her that she had looked terrified and that this had both amused him and made him faintly curious. At the time, he had merely shaken his head, disappeared between the bookshelves, and then re-emerged with a heavy leather tome, which he settled down to read at the other end of her table. Eleanor laboured on, making more notes, doing her best to look engaged and scholarly. "That sounds painful," he said at length. "I beg your pardon?" He pushed his book away and tipped his chair onto its back 2 legs, crossing his arms and hooking his knees under the table for balance. "Your stomach," he grinned, "unless there is a gremlin living under your section of carpet." Eleanor felt the blood rush to her face. Only too aware of the rumbles emanating from her empty stomach, she had been working with one arm pinned across her lap in a bid to stifle the worst. "Call me Sherlock, but my guess is you haven't had lunch." Eleanor shook her head, still dry-mouthed with embarrassment. "Me neither," he confessed cheerfully. "We could grab something together if you like. Miss Coulham can wait, and frankly, with all the noise your innards are making, I'm not taking in much of this anyway." "God, sorry." "I was joking," he pointed out, looking bemused. "I'm Nick, by the way. Nick Wharton." He leant across the table, all mock formality now, to shake her hand. "Eleanor Keating." "So, do you fancy a bite of lunch, Eleanor Keating?" "Yes. OK, thanks." She set about trying to tidy away the circle of books which tumbled, messing up her precious markers. "You could just leave that lot," he ventured after a few moments. "I mean, it's hardly likely to get nicked, is it?" "No. Yes, of course. Good idea." Eleanor fumbled the books into yet more chaos, aware of him watching and of what felt like the liquid state of her brain. He held the door open for her to go down the entrance steps first, announcing as they set off that he knew a good place in the covered market. Outside, the November wind tore at their clothes, rendering it impossible to talk even in the relatively high-walled protection of the college's main quad. Once in the high street, Eleanor double-wrapped her scarf round the lower half of her face and concentrated on keeping up with her escort's long stride, sneaking sideways glances to marvel both at the apparent warmth of the heavy cabled jumper and the simple pleasure of walking beside someone who was taller than her by several inches. He had to be 6'3" at least. He moved loosely, hands in his pockets, cocking his head at the handsome spired buildings and the grey sky as if it was a balmy summer day. Eleanor had passed through the covered market several times, but only to enjoy its jumble of artisan stalls and peer through the windows of its boutique shops. Nick led the way to a tiny cafe she had never noticed, a handful of tables in checkered cloths next to a counter, in front of an open cooking range. He instructed her to commandeer the only free table while he queued for 2 plates of sausages, baked beans and scrambled eggs, having assured her that it was the only thing on the menu worth eating and offering to pay. He ate ravenously, talking between mouthfuls about the travails of being a third-year medic and how, if it hadn't been for the pressure from his father, a consultant neurologist, he would have applied to read English. "I'd even like a crack at Anglo-Saxon," he admitted ruefully, after Eleanor, sufficiently restored by some food and the openness of his manner, had confessed to the creeping sense of despair over tackling the Beowulf essay. "It's a bit like German, isn't it?" "I don't know what it's like. I've never done German, only Latin and French, but that's a fat lot of good." "But what about the rest of your year? How are they getting on?" "They sort of keep to themselves. There are only 6 of us, and they're so brainy compared to me, the boys especially. There's one other girl, Megan, but someone told me she's really into the Christian Union." "Oh, blimey! You'll want to steer well clear of her in that case." He paused briefly in his eating to skewer a finger to his temple. "But I bet those others aren't brainier than you," he went on amiably. "Boys are really good at pretending to appear as if they know what they're talking about. Trust me, I know." He closed his mouth around his last forkful of beans, his dark blue eyes flashing. Eleanor smiled back shyly, her mind fast-tracking through the unpromising males with whom she had hitherto been acquainted, all of them classmates, some of them glib talkers, some not, like Charlie Watson, with his big, kind face and thick-set body, who had carried his own silence and shyness like a heavy load. It had been one of the main reasons she had felt drawn to him. It's mostly bluff, Nick concluded, watching her carefully. Remember that. So, where did you go to school anyway?
A tiny place in East Sussex. Broughton. You wouldn't have heard of it. Eleanor hesitated. It didn't seem a good moment to mention that she was the daughter of a vicar. A motherless daughter of a vicar. Even without the Christian Union thing, all of it felt embarrassing, like something that needed confessing to, rather than fodder for general conversation. I'm the first person in the entire history of the school to have done Oxbridge, she said brightly instead. I only managed it because I had masses of extra lessons. There was this teacher there who liked me. Eleanor stopped. She had been about to say that Miss Saffron had believed in her, but it sounded too grandiose.
Wow! Congratulations in that case. Loads of people feel daunted here at first, he added kindly. It soon wears off. Don't be afraid to use your own brain would be my advice. He beamed at her encouragingly.
Eleanor felt her insides dissolve, not with hunger, but something else that she would have found impossible to describe. Close to embarrassment, but more pleasant, and without the side effect of the red face. It somehow made it difficult to continue eating. So, you would have liked to study English? She prompted, grabbing at the question purely as a way of diverting attention from the sensation.
Oh, yes. Sort of. In my dreams, at least.
He sat back, smiling and pushing his empty plate away. And who are your favourite writers, if you don't mind my asking? It was like she had pulled a trigger. He seemed to explode forwards onto his elbows, landing with such vigour that the table tipped sideways.
Amos, obviously.
He held the table down as if it might leap again of its own accord. Obviously. Eleanor slowly carved a tiny piece of sausage. She assumed he meant Martin rather than Kingsley, but she hadn't read either.
Mainly for the Rachel papers, but money is right up there too. Then there's Fowles, because of The Collector, and D.H. Lawrence, not so much for Sons and Lovers or even Women in Love or Lady Chatterley. Not that one can discount any of them, but in my view, The Rainbow is his true masterpiece. And then there's Forster, of course, not so cutting edge, but still a genius. Though when it comes to geniuses, Nabokov has to take the biscuit, for Lolita, obviously. But then there's Laughter in the Dark and...
Eleanor gawped as he plunged on, scooping up Conrad, T.S. Eliot and Shakespeare in his wake. It was like watching a small typhoon, a typhoon which made her heart race.
He was a lepidopterist, did you know?
It took a moment to realise he was expecting a response. Oh, what? Who?
A butterfly lover, Nabokov. And as soon as I found that out, I just thought it was significant. I mean...
A new group of students were hovering, pointedly eyeing their empty plates, clutching discarded coats and hats, their faces pink and steaming from the outside cold. Nick did not seem to notice. He was still talking in a rush.
Take Lolita. It's almost like he has ensnared this beautiful specimen of youth, of nascent sexuality, and he wants to keep it, to keep her, pinned under a glass, so he can scrutinise and feed off it and...
Isn't The Collector also a bit like that? Eleanor ventured, seizing one of the rare moments when he paused for breath. At least, doesn't a girl get taken prisoner? She lost courage, having only indirectly heard about the Fowles book from Camilla, who had pronounced it the creepiest thing she had ever read. But Nick was already slamming the tabletop in delight.
Brilliant! That's a great thought, a great connection.
The people clutching their coats exchanged glances and shuffled to another vacated table.
Fowles and Nabokov as literary lepidopterists. Hey, that works really well.
He sat back, subdued but visibly pleased.
I like the way things connect if one looks at them hard enough. Only connect is Forster's mantra, isn't it? Eleanor burst out, still shy but starting to enjoy herself. In Howard's End. It's the only one of his I've read, but I really enjoyed it. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted. Or something. Wilcox's and Schlegel's. The Wilcox's being the prose, the Schlegel's the passion. Joining forces.
They looked at each other happily. Nick had a wide, generous mouth.